Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest tonight, we promised you Jennifer Marohasy, scientist, author, and speaker, and she is here live from tomorrow and the other side of the world. It's amazing. It's Wednesday here, Thursday over there, and if you don't know about Jennifer Marohasy, she is an amazing biologist, an ecologist. She got her PhD in the late 90s. She's now an activist and a speaker. She is on she's one of the major senior fellows at the Institute on Public Affairs, and she has been traveling the globe, specifically in Australia, to kind of point out some of the heresies that are happening in science, whether it be the reefs, the policies, or just the climate fraud that's happening. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, really well, thank you.
So let's start the conversation.
Last time,
go ahead.
So last time we were talking, it was about my film Beige Reef. That came out in last November. Mm-hmm. So time flies, doesn't it? So last November we were talking about the film Beige Reef. And then just yesterday, and how the inshore reefs were beautiful, even though they'd said that they'd all got covered in mud and they'd all been ruined. I actually went to where they said the inshore reefs were the worst, and where Nature, a paper in the prestigious journal Nature had said all the reefs are dead. And we found 25 hectares of beautiful coral in one spot. That was the basis of Beige Reef. And then just across the channel, there's about 40 hectares of beautiful coral, and so it goes on. And, I got back from that trip and, we made the film, and it was wonderful to talk about it with you, Beige Reef. And people said to me, they said, "But Jen, that's not where the coral's bleached." I said, "Yeah, I know. That's the inshore reefs that you said had been completely wiped out." They said, "If you want to find bleached coral, you need to go north. You need to go to the Ribbons." And I said, "Okay, well, let me find some money and see if Clint, the underwater photographer, will come with me." And so we actually went to the Ribbons in January. And that was meant to be where there was the worst bleaching. And we actually had a lot of trouble finding bleaching. But do you want to talk about that yet? Have your viewers seen my new film, Clowns on the Ribbon's Edge, which is directly relevant to the headlines yesterday? Did you hear in the States about how they said that half the reef was dead? That's in the journals. It's not in real life.
Yeah. Well, your films prove that not half of the reefs are not dead. But we do have the headline here. I'll just put it up for the people watching. The Great Barrier Reef has lost half its corals within 3 decades. This is coming out of CNN. So would you like to discuss the paper?
So the headlines were here yesterday, and I went, well, let me find this paper. How are they coming to this conclusion? And by the way, one of the authors of the paper is Terry Hughes, and he's the same fellow who couldn't find the corals at Bramston Reef because he wouldn't walk the other side of the mudflat. So this guy's got form in terms of telling us there's no corals, and then you go to the same places and you actually find them. But never mind. This paper, and they come up with a new method for determining coral cover and coral calcification rates. So for years there was a particular method in place, but it wasn't giving them the answers that they wanted, it seems. So what they're now doing is, I've just got this thing that's come across my screen. Don't you love it when people text you and it just fills up your screen? I'll ignore that. Can you see the text message from my brother?
No, we can't.
Oops, close it down. You can't see it, I should just ignore it. Anyway, so this new paper that's just come out yesterday, it doesn't actually say that half the corals are dead, but you can sort of maybe get there in a roundabout way if you understand that they didn't do any direct measures. They've come up with this new proxy system for measuring the extent of coral cover. So it's proxies, not actual real observations. I think a proxy vote is a delegated vote, and what they've done here is they've delegated a method of measuring coral cover to themselves. Then they've actually gone to reefs that were worst affected, some of the reefs that were worst affected by the cyclones in 2014 and 2015. So one of the sites is North Direction Island, which is pretty much where we filmed in my new short documentary. And then they actually went there just at the end of the recent bleaching. Now, bleaching follows these cycles, particularly the 18.6-year lunar declination cycles. So they went there right after one of these bleaching events. So they went to the reefs badly affected by cyclones right after a bleaching event, and they used a new method for measurement. And guess what? They discovered that that half the reefs, half the coral's gone. But that was for that reef, or those few reefs, for that moment in time. It's not representative of the whole Great Barrier Reef, but even for those reefs for that moment in time, move on 3 years. So the study was done in 2016-17. I went back to those reefs the beginning of this year, 3 years on, and the corals that had been really badly bleached. So in the film, at 6 minutes, you'll see the monolith. It's a huge, old, massive colony of Pavana clavis, and it stretches 30 meters up a ridge. It was apparently stark white back in 2016 from the bleaching, from the elevated temperatures and the low sea levels. When I was there at the beginning of this year, it had taken back all its zooxanthellae. It was colourful again. It had zooxanthellae. It was a subtle beige colour. But there were other corals that were red and purple and blue. It had all fully recovered in 3 years. And yet the journalist yesterday was saying that these same corals were dead. There's these cycles and then these lag periods between when a paper's published and when they decide to make it the front page of CNN and Washington Post or Sydney Morning Herald. It was all over the news here. The Great Barrier Reef is dead. I tried to get journalists to go to Beige Reef with me. They wouldn't go. I tried to get journalists to come up to the Ribbons Reef with me. They won't come up there because they love to just repeat the headlines from the make-believe in the journals that it's all dead.
Yeah, and an actual journalist would want to go with you and be breaking the story. That would be what an actual journalist would want to do. And so real quick, let's talk about, can we interject here and talk about Peter Ridd real quick and what happened with him? Do you have any inside information?
So I talk to Peter every few days. We've been friends for 20 years now. And of course, I went to Beige Reef in the beginning because, I went to Beige Reef last year. The first time I went there was at Easter time. That was just when the judgment had been handed down the first time. That was in the federal court where they'd found in his favor. And that was a huge relief for us all, except that I was a bit concerned that they'd said, well, he's entitled to his own opinion, and we don't seem to know whether there are or aren't corals off Bowen. But they cleared him. I said, well, we need to go there and actually just check how those corals are faring, because since he sent the photographs to say there are actually corals there, we've had a cyclone through. As it turned out, the cyclone Debbie that went through there in April 2015 didn't much damage the corals there. And I took the photographer back and we filmed them the end of last year. But since then, the university's appealed, and the most recent judgment by a panel of 3 judges is that again, they didn't really care whether there was corals or not, but they decided that Peter didn't have a right to his opinion because he's an employee of a university and he should always be collegial. And he got too excited about the fact that this scientist, activist, Terry Hughes, had said that there were no corals when there were corals. Peter should have just had the discussion with him quietly. He shouldn't have gone on television and said that that Terry Hughes was just making stuff up, which is, and because Peter had been so uncollegial, even if he was truthful, the university had a right to fire him. So that's why he lost the most recent round in the courts. But guess what? We said, don't worry, Peter, we'll do some more fundraising. And Peter actually said to me after the last round, that's it, Jen, I'm done. But then after 2 days, he said, okay, I'm right again, we'll go again. And he's now submitted papers to our High Court, where we're hoping they're going to take a more expansive view of it. And they're going, I'm just hoping that before we get to the High Court, somebody's going to come to me, with me, to the Great Barrier Reef, be it a lawyer, be it a journalist. And, you know, I'm quite happy to go to the reefs that they say are the worst. And there is always somewhere that's just been hit by a cyclone. But let's go and look there. Let's also go and look at the reefs off Bowen. Let's also look at the ribbon reefs because, you know, most of the Great Barrier Reef is still beautiful. It's colourful corals in crystal clear water, warm water. It's so much fun jumping off those boats, going under the water, seeing all the fish, seeing all the corals.
Well, some people are afraid of being eaten by all the sharks. And some of the largest sharks live on the Great Barrier Reef. But look, Sky News has shouted our channel out several times over the last few months. And you were just on Sky News. I'm sure someone at Sky News would be able to be granted a day or two to do a small mini documentary with you. Don't you think that's a good partner?
I think that would be fantastic. And I can organize boats. No problems at all, or they can organize boats. It's actually no problem. There's inner reefs, middle reefs, and there's outer reefs. There's reefs that have been bleached, though it's actually pretty difficult finding any bleaching at the Great Barrier Reef at the moment. But we can try our best, and along the way we'll probably find some pretty reefs.
I find that mind-blowing that if you asked a huge cross-section of the world that are scientifically knowledgeable about what they know about the Great Barrier Reef, they would all say, oh, it's all bleached and it's dying and it's dead. And now we're talking to a scientist who actually scuba dives it. And you were telling me earlier before we started, it's almost impossible to find some bleaching on some sections.
At the moment, so back in 2016, there was a lot of bleaching, but those same reefs that bleached really badly in 2016 have pretty much all recovered, 100%. They're just spectacular. Yeah. And yet people are, they're publishing papers now about what it was like, saying that that's how it is now, which is just not true. And what is really disappointing is that, you just can't get the journalists to go out with you to have a look. I just find that extraordinary. And I guess you can say, but hey, look, you know, like there's a dive industry, so surely if it was as good as you say, Jen, the people who have got a commercial interest in this, they're going to speak up. But you know what happened in 2016? There's only actually 2 boats, and can I tell you this in some confidence? You don't have a lot of listeners, do you?
No.
Can I tell you this anyway? There's really just 2 dive boats that go around that northern region that was meant to have been the worst bleached in 2016. And, you know, they knew that there was some bad bleaching, but they also knew, because they're out there every day, that most of the reef was still fantastic, but because the headlines came out at that time that it had all been bleached, they just got cancellations all over the place from people who were going to visit from the States, for example, and go diving with them. So they actually put their boats to work just documenting the specific reefs that this guy, Terry Hughes, had said were really badly bleached. And they took all this video and they actually went and showed this guy, Terry Hughes. They took it to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. They took it to the politicians. They dared not go to the media, because you know what would have happened if they went to the media? They would have lost their permits to operate those boats on the Great Barrier Reef. Sorry to get upset. This is Australia in 2017. If the dive operators make a fuss about the scientists lying, they will lose their permits to operate. Just like Peter Ridd lost his job. And this is what keeps me going, because I really hate the fact that I now live in a Western democracy where there are people who are so frightened to speak the truth because they will lose their job, they will lose their permit, their capacity to operate. It is so sad, and I don't think it's unique to Australia. My brother was texting me before. Now I think he's trying to ring me. Can you hear the phone going?
Yeah.
Can you hear my phone?
It sounds like a parrot.
Will I go and turn it off?
Sure, go ahead.
I should have turned the phone off, shouldn't I?
Yeah. You can go do it. I could pause this real quick.
Okay, thank you.
So it's become quite a sad state of affairs that we're living in when policy drives the science. And so what's happened over the last several decades is a breakdown of really scientific endeavor, where there's people fabricating data or manipulating it. I love how everything is homogenized, or there's a proxy, or anything to explain that I'm not actually going to read the actual, go out there and take the actual measurements. I'm just going to use something else that actually works with my end game here. So that's the state of science, in my opinion. And you've been fighting back through the Institute of Public Affairs by publishing books on climate change and the work of scientists with integrity. And there's a new edition that just came out, 2020 Climate Change. And tell us about it, because you're the lead editor, author. Tell me what that means. Like, your name's on it, but you didn't. There's like dozens of authors in there.
So there's 20 authors and there's 20 chapters, and the book's got 3 sections to it. So the first section is about the polar regions, and it includes a section, chapter by Susan Crockford about polar bears. There's a chapter by Jim Steele about penguins. There's a chapter in that first section by Roy Spencer about the satellite record and sea ice extent and temperatures at the North and South Poles. So there's a first section about polar regions. There's a second section towards new theories of climate, which is mostly about clouds, because I love watching clouds. And that second section's got a chapter by Richard Lindzen and also a chapter by Henrik Svensmark, both atmospheric physicists who have spent their careers studying clouds. And then there is a third section which is about institutional failure, and I write a chapter in there about bushfires, and there's a chapter in there about temperature homogenization, and there's a chapter, the very last chapter, chapter 20 by Scott Hargraves, where he actually categorizes skeptics in terms of where they anyway, chapter 20 is fantastic, and it's really the only philosophical chapter in the book. But let's not start there, but maybe we can get there. But you say, as the editor, what do I get to do? Well, I guess I get to scope out with the publisher what chapters might be included. And so the publisher tends to just say, oh, we want the high-profile people who have got university positions. And I go, well, hang on, let's let's think about some themes. So the last book was a lot about homogenization of temperatures, whereas with this book I said, no, let's sort of go on to something completely different in terms of the technical. And I asked if I could be indulged in terms of let's actually talk about the importance of clouds and how they can affect atmospheric circulation. And the publisher said, well, of course you're going to include Peter Ridd and he's going to write about the Great Barrier Reef. And I said, well, he wrote about the Great Barrier Reef in the last book. Peter and I have been talking about tropical convection now for 20 years. He's not going to get it published in any journals anymore. Now he's been sacked from the university. Let me get Peter to write about clouds in the tropics and how they can move, the thunderstorms can move. Well, Peter, in this book, in chapter 12, which sits neatly with the chapter by Richard Lindzen and Henrik Svensmark and Jeff Duffy, what Peter does is build on the work of Joanne Simpson, who was a very famous American meteorologist, I think the first woman to get a PhD in meteorology back in 1949. And she was a very highly regarded US meteorologist. And she basically explained how so much of how the atmosphere works and how a lot of the heat on the surface in the tropics gets taken up to the top of the atmosphere where it can be radiated to space by these thunderstorms. And Peter and I both love watching tropical thunderstorms because we're both from Northern Australia. And I don't know about where you live, but where we live, you get these late in the afternoon in summer, you get these fireworks shows, these electrical storms. There's lots of noise, there's lots of light, and they're these cumulonimbus clouds as featured on the front cover here, and and Peter explains in his chapter that with the increase in greenhouse gases, you've actually got an increase in the efficiency of what he talks about as the heat engines for the atmosphere, building on Joanne Simpson's work, and how, okay, we may have elevated levels of carbon dioxide, but we don't actually have runaway global warming. And that's maybe because these cumulonimbus clouds through these thunderstorms are taking the energy in the greenhouse gases up to the top where it's radiated to space. And that idea that that theory that is quite specific to increasing efficiency of the heat engine with more greenhouse gases actually fits really neatly with Richard Lindzen's theory, which he wrote about the iris effect 20 years ago. And it's interesting because the publisher was really keen to have Richard Lindzen as an author in this book. And Richard was really keen to contribute, but he sort of wanted to write about the philosophy of science. And I said, no, Richard, I want you to write about the iris effect. And he said, Jen, nobody understands it. Like, I wrote that paper 20 years ago. People don't understand it. It's just caused me grief. Can't I just write about, he does it really well when he writes about funding and corruption and all of that. But I said, no, Richard, I really want you writing about the iris effect, because I knew that fitted neatly with Peter's ideas, building on the work of Joanne Simpson. And I also knew that it fitted really neatly with Henrik Svensmark's work on cosmic rays and cloud cover. So in the book, we've got chapter 11, we've got Henrik Svensmark talking about low clouds and how they cast a shadow and how they can have a cooling effect. And then we've got Richard Lindzen talking about high level clouds and how they can generate a greenhouse effect by keeping stuff in. But then we've got Peter Ridd talking about how actually, and Richard Lindzen talks about how with more greenhouse gases, you've got less cirrus cloud. And Peter's theory sort of it supports it and sort of it comes at it from a different way. So I get the authors lined up, but then I sort of push them down a particular direction, even sometimes against their will. I'm a bit naughty to be telling Richard Lindzen what he can and can't write in terms of topic. But I succeeded, and in doing that, we've got section 2, which is so good because Jeff Duffy, who's a professor from University of Auckland in New Zealand, sets the scene talking about water vapor and water and clouds, and then Henrik Svensmark, clouds and how that can be affected by cosmic ray cycles, sun's magnetism, then Richard Lindzen's cirrus clouds and his iris effect. And I think it's so important that we've got a plain English explanation of this paper, such an important paper that Richard published 20 years ago. And then after that, we've got Peter Ridd's chapter, which, because Peter's a mate, I got to say, and Peter, don't forget this and don't forget that. And it's such a good chapter building on the work of Joanne Simpson. So that's just section 2 of the book. And I talk too much sometimes, don't I?
So go out and get the book. We're going to give you links to Climate Change, the Facts 2020. You can buy it on Amazon, but they're ripping you off. It's $60, I think, on Amazon. If you come over to the climatechangethefacts.org website here, it's only $39. And for $99, you can get a year membership to the Institute of Public Affairs. And don't you guys send out like quarterly reports there? What do you get with that membership?
So we do all sorts of different things. But if you're a member, you can get a hard copy. This is a hard copy version. It's such a good one. But yeah, so I mean, I just think the IPA is really trying hard on a whole lot of fronts, from the perspective of wanting government policy to be evidence-based, from the perspective of supporting me, from the perspective of supporting Peter Ridd, because, you know, just let me show you the previous book. That was Climate Change, the Facts, 2017. And Peter was writing, he wrote the first, this got the Great Barrier Reef on the front of this one. And he wrote the chapter for this book back in 2015-16, when he was having the arguments with the scientists about how much coral there was. And I said to Peter, can you please write us a chapter for this book? Nobody knew who Peter Ridd was at the time, but make it about coral calcification, because that's going to become the bigger issue into the future. And he said, Jen, it's not going to do me any good from a career perspective. And I said, please. And he wrote the chapter, and that chapter, and then he did media for me, and that chapter really got him sacked. And when he got his first censure, I rang the guys up at the IPA and I said, look, we've got the guy into all this trouble. Can we give him a hand? And John Roscombe, who runs the IPA, he rang a barrister who he knew and said, you got to help this guy now. And it made all the difference, because it just got Peter a bit of help before we got a fundraising program in place. And at that time, Peter was he was going to walk away, and he wasn't going to make a fuss, which is what most academics do. But because he knew that the IPA was behind him, he actually stood and fought. And then John Roscombe got him in touch with barristers, and barristers said, key barrister said, well, if we take this angle or that angle, and Peter said, so I can actually appeal all of this, I can actually fight for my job back, and they said yes. And so it makes all the difference when you got organizations behind you who can find people, because when you're being threatened with being sacked, the last thing that you're doing is going through the white pages trying to find legal representation. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, and academia is going in the exact opposite direction it should be. When you have to defend yourself with lawyers because you're a scientist with integrity, and you actually have the moxie to speak against the mainstream narrative, which, by the way, the mainstream media and governments, they are not scientists. I could tell you, they do not go out to the outcrops or the quarries or look at the reefs. They're not doing the scientific work. They're not even fact-checking the scientific papers. There are papers with bad information, which have, there some climatologists still using CMIP6 models when we're in CMIP or CMIP3, when we're all the way at CMIP6. And they're doing that because they know the models are false. They give false warning to human activity. And the newer models give more credence to things like cosmic rays and particle forcing, which have been completely left out of the older models, which we now know are complete garbage. But they continue to use the garbage models because it fits the narrative. So, and it's only getting worse. So
that's the think tanks like the way to let me publish papers that fit together in books like this. So I think they are worth supporting, and it is worth going and buying this book. But the book's not all, because you're talking about paradigmization and, how these models deal with things like clouds or can't deal with things like clouds because of your grid area sizes. There is a bit of this in section 2 of this book, but, the section 3 of this book section 1 is really for the nature lovers. So it's about polar bears and penguins and it includes stuff by biologists and ecologists. So I really love section 1. I also like section 2, but it is a bit of the hard science. But then we've got section 3 with chapters on bushfires and a bit on renewable energy. And then the last chapter is quite philosophical by Scott Hargraves, and it actually makes the analogy between Dante's famous poem Inferno and how when you're a skeptic it can be, when Peter, he was at that same university for 30 years. When he lost his job, he lost a huge number of friends. He didn't only lose his office at work, and he lost so many friends because they knew that if they stayed friends with Peter, their jobs were under jeopardy as well. So chapter 20 of this book talks about how, and I've actually said, I say in the introduction, maybe you should read chapter 20 first, because if you seek the truth about climate change in the pages of this book, you can get drawn down into one of these or down sequentially into the 9 circles of hell. And it is a bit lonely, that path. As you move closer to the truth, it can be a bit like moving closer to the fire. I think Anthony Watts has got that great quote. Just move towards the fire. Don't worry about what they call you. And I think that's so important. People should seek out the evidence, but they should also be aware that they may lose some of their old friends, and we all need friends. So it is important that they listen to programs like yours and understand that there are alternative perspectives and that maybe they can find some new friends and some new literature.
Oh, that's very beautiful the way you put that. And we appreciate you coming on the show and giving us a little bit of your time. Before we started recording, we were talking about how funny it is that even in Australia, the mainstream media there is reporting the same lies that are here in North America. You were saying that now they're pushing the fact that your cyclones are bigger and more deadly and stronger. And it's the same in our media here. And all you have to do is spend 10 minutes on any search engine and go just research the deadliest hurricanes ever. You're going to find they were back in the 1800s and early 1900s and not today. And there were more stronger hurricanes 100 years ago and even 200 years ago than today. But the media gets away with it. How much further towards complete fantasy land can we actually get? And will there be a reset somehow?
Talking about hurricanes, in Australia we have cyclones, and in response to these media headlines saying that all the reef is dead because that paper says that that it's getting knocked more often by cyclones and bleaching events, but when you actually, as you say, scratch the surface, look at the data, that's not what it actually says. So in the next day or so at my blog, which is at jennifermarohasy.com, I'll put up a link to the Australian cyclone data. and it very unequivocally shows that there's been a reduction in both the number and intensity of cyclone. So I'll put that data up in the next 24 hours at jennifermarohasy.com. In terms of, is there going to be a reset? What can we do about it? You know, we can just all do our best. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come on this program and talk about my 2 films. And I really appreciate the opportunity to promote the new book. So I just think we can just all do our best and with integrity and fearlessly, and I guess support people who we trust and we think can make a difference. So I've put a lot of time into supporting Peter Reid over the last couple of years, and I keep doing that. And so it means that I don't necessarily do some things that I know people get a bit cranky because they send me emails and I don't respond to them. But, you know, I could spend time every day sitting at the computer responding to emails, or I could spend time out there organizing my next dive trip. And so, you know, we can't do everything, and we make choices in terms of what we do. I've chosen to come on this program with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I know you're one of the good guys, and keep doing what you're doing because we love you.
Well, we appreciate you too. And guys, we're going to send you links to Jennifer's blog. Her website is jennifermarohasy.com, where you can link up. We'll have links to both of her films there, Beige Reef, and now her newest film, Under the Sea at the Ribbon Reefs.
Clowns on the Ribbon Sea.
Yeah, so, and there's links in the blog to those films. Also, her new book, Climate Change, The Facts 2020, 20 amazing authors with a final chapter, which you need to read first, about the hell that you will be brought to once you learn the truth. Always a pleasure having you on the show, Jen. And maybe we should do this more often, and let's talk about how successful the book is in a few months. What say you?
That sounds like a great idea. Yeah, once a month or something.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for coming on the show, and have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye.